Remote work, hybrid work, it's a thing. Whether organizations want to embrace it or not, the world demonstrated that it can still function, sometimes even more productively, when doing it from home. But even when it's part of the new way of working, it's been a struggle for so many leaders, as they're just not sure how to incorporate what they know and what's worked before for them around culture building in a remote or hybrid world. It's a conversation we've had and will continue to have on this show, and today is no exception. My guest has been working with remote teams for years across the globe, and she's going to share her experiences with us today on how to build culture with those teams. Hold on. Welcome back to Relationships at Work, the leadership guide to creating a workplace we love. I'm Russel, a longtime communications and leadership nerd with a couple of decades of experience in both, and a whole heap of curiosity on how we can make the workplace better. This show is a great place to start. Speaking of starting, so many organizations think onboarding is where the employee journey begins. And some of those same organizations think that's actually where it ends too. To help leaders think differently, I put together a free tool that looks at onboarding, staying, and exit interviews as a holistic journey, each feeding off each other as part of a way of understanding the employee experience. It's, to be frank, part of my mission to change the word stay for those stay interviews into thrive interviews. We don't just want people to stay, we want them to grow, we want them to thrive. So why not ask questions that reflect that? It's not just about bums in seats. Go to relationshipsatwork.ca and find at the top menu there's a free employee interviews to download. You're welcome. Like I said, onboarding is a big conversation, and I think we need to look at the bigger picture. I don't know if remote work is much different. I've had a lot of conversations about remote work, especially since I started this show. I see a lot of content from Harvard Business Review, Forbes, Entrepreneur, all about remote work, trying to crack that nut. TikToks, Reels about remote work. We've talked about it on this podcast a few times, and I have a feeling, we will again in the future. Actually, very not too distant future today. This continues to be a hot topic for a lot of organizations too, because trying to wrap their brains around seeing employees on virtual screens rather than in cubicles, it seems to be this bridge too far for many. Culture, empowerment, engagement, recognition, communication, these all now have this new lens to them in a remote world. I had a chat with someone recently on a virtual team. We talked about the importance of culture, and he really thought more work needed to be done to establish his particular virtual team's culture. But then, and I'm pretty familiar with this team, I said, let's think about this for a minute. It already has a culture. There's lighthearted jokes, challenges to authority or power, challenge to the status quo. People feel comfortable, psychologically safe to bring up ideas that may not necessarily be in alignment with where the projects are going. Tons of curiosity. There's a desire to learn. That's a culture. It was interesting to have that conversation with him because he took a step back and almost was proud of something that he didn't think even existed a few moments ago. This just demonstrates we have some work to do around understanding what we're trying to do when it comes to culture and remote work. My guest today has been working with not only remote teams, but also ones around the world. Different cultures, different languages. You think just having a remote team down the street is difficult and challenging. Imagine if they're in another country. Her experience in building connection virtually has been extremely vital to her success in creating effective teams and coaching team effectiveness around the planet for some pretty big organizations. She talks about a few things that I think we really need to prioritize if we want to take remote and hybrid work seriously. So let's get talking to Janet. And on the show today, we have Janet Livingstone, and here is why she is awesome. She is the founder of Culture is Key, a consultancy devoted to leadership development, executive coaching, and team effectiveness. And part of that work is cultivating connection for remote hybrid teams, which is really handy because that's the topic today. Speaking of different cultures, she speaks multiple languages and has traveled and worked in countries all over the world, helping leaders be more effective. Some of her clients include IBM, Boeing, O2 Telefonica, and she's also a fellow podcaster. She's the co-host of Original Syndrome podcast, focusing on gender equality and women's empowerment through humor. Hello, Janet.
Hello. Nice to be here.
Actually, quick question before we get into the first question. Where are you right now?
Ah, I am in former Czechoslovakia, in the capital of Slovakia, Bratislava, or in Slovak, Bratislava.
Sounds good. Like, I was trying to think,
Yep.
are you the furthest away guest? You may be. I've had some Australians, so it's like
Oh,
pretty far away from Victoria, but meh.
I think the Australians have me beat. Yeah. Picture, a lot of people don't know where this place is. Picture 60 kilometers east of Vienna, Austria.
Now I want to travel there so very badly.
Yeah, you should.
So, starting off, as I do every episode, with the same question, which is, Janet, what's your best or worst employee experience?
Okay. I'm going to try to hit both of these, Russell. Worst was probably when I started working in this country, and it was still Czechoslovakia at that time. In the early 90s, I worked for a nonprofit that did education stuff. We placed Western lecturers, sort of mostly PhD students from the US, in universities over here because this part of the world, post-communism, didn't have a lot of professors who could handle non-Marxist style social sciences. So they were teaching, economics and political science under the, umbrella of Marxist-Leninist thought. So they didn't have anybody to teach Western economics or political science also through a democratic lens or that kind of stuff. So the reason that was a bad job was because I was country director for Czechoslovakia, and that meant I had to take care of a bunch of PhD students, many of whom were not successful, who didn't have their degrees and were mad about it and had brought their families over and were pretty demanding and were not mentally or emotionally prepared to live in a country that was post-socialism. I'm going to use the word socialism because that's what they use here. Post-socialism, which means that the conditions weren't terribly good. You still had to go to the supermarket, which was not a supermarket, it was a store, and you had to stand at a counter and ask for every single item to be handed to you. And things were, right? Things were difficult. The trams drove at crazy speeds. There was, no English language press to speak of, and it was just a different era. And I got a ton of complaining, and I had no support from the center because it was a startup NGO. We ended up having a big impact because it was funded by the Soros Foundation and it became a big deal, but I was there kind of in the cowboy days. So that was not fun.
Yeah,
Anyway,
fair.
and the good one is
Yeah.
one that a job that I've been doing for a while, and especially as a facilitator, and that is helping Boeing build relationships with their customers in Asia through delivery of leadership development programs. And in the beginning, I got to do a whole bunch of facilitation with Chinese airline folks who would come over to Seattle en masse, like 25 of them, right? The cohort would come for 2 weeks. And basically, what we did was wine and dine them, have really interesting learning, leadership and learning programs during the day. And I get to watch them learn. And then my colleague would come with his guitar and we would all sing together. And I got paid pretty well to do that. And, for me, that's like, you're going to pay me to do this? So yeah, it's pretty good.
What a juxtaposition, because I don't get to use that word often, between two environments. That one was very much supportive and nurturing in change, which is the learning and the development, versus no support during radical change for a lot of employees and culture. So support matters, everybody. Anybody listening at home, no matter what you're going through, it can really help the change process.
So well put, Russell. You nailed it. It was ironic. People didn't truly understand what kind of change was happening, how monumental it was. That's part of the problem, right? As humans, we don't always understand what is happening to us in the moment or how important it is, how important it will be. And, I think we should all strive to be more aware, look around, talk to people, observe what is happening to us. Just general comment.
No, fair comment. I mean, and if leadership can actually lead and provide some of that context support during those times of change, it makes messy change a little less messier anyway.
Exactly.
Speaking of change, oh my goodness, has one been a big one over the last couple of years, more so than it ever has before, which is remote and hybrid work. Now,
Mhm.
generally, when I start every episode, I always feel it's best to start with defining what we're talking about. And for
Mhm.
this one, I thought it was odd because I'm like, isn't it kind of straightforward? Because immediately I think remote is you don't work in the office, and hybrid is half in the office, sometimes out of the office. Am I missing a piece here? Is it more complex than that?
For me, it has more complexity because on top of that, I deal with multicultural hybrid work. So, a lot of us don't have the choice of, oh, we're going to be at home today or we're going to be at the office today, right? We have no choice. The team is, people from who are in Singapore, people who are in China, people who are in India, people who are in Seattle, people who are in Washington, D.C. Uh, yeah, that's the norm. And we all fight with time zones continually. I got my sword out today for triple time zones. I'm in Slovakia, which is kind of equidistant between Seattle and Asia, most Asian countries, India, China, etc. So that means that if I want to run a meeting with everybody, I have to be up between 2 and 4 a.m., which is crap. It's difficult. I was in bed on a meeting last night at 1:30. And I'm glad I was on because we got some kudos. But still, it was not enough to make me feel well rested in the morning. So I think that the hybrid environment creates challenges for all of us as humans. It makes us feel more distant from each other. It makes us feel disconnected. Nothing new, right? We've all heard about how Zoom and Teams and all the two-dimensional screen-based communication that we do is a strain on our brains because we're all looking for cues. What is he wearing? How does he move? What is she doing? What is happening behind her? I can Yeah, we don't get nearly as much information as we need. And if you compound that with talking with a variety of people from different cultures who communicate differently, who even move differently, it just makes it even harder. And it's all the more reason to really intentionally recognize it and deal with it and practice being connected.
I always found it funny when organizations would use words like innovation or we only hire the best. Okay, but only the best if they're 15 kilometers from the office where they can drive in. Or they're innovation, but wait, there's been a bunch of change. So we want to revert to the 1950s where everybody has to work in the office. So
Yeah,
innovation only seems to work when it's a buzzword, not when it's a way of working. So there's a
yeah.
lot of change that people seem to have a problem with. Is this a generational problem? Because leaders are having a huge issue, but most of the leaders that I see having issue are, to be blunt, old white people at the top of the organization that are, but that's not how I became successful mentality. So they have to enforce this
Yeah.
return to work or what they're used to. But it just seems so generational.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It is generational to a large extent, I would say. I mean, obviously Gen Zers and, younger millennials are really, really comfortable running their lives online, but it doesn't mean that they don't suffer from the same effects, right? They may have a different attitude toward it, but their brains are still working hard to figure out what's happening on the other end. They're still stressed out because there are so many communication channels that are all remote that they have to keep track of, right? I mean, I have two kids who are Gen Zers, and one of them said, "No way, no more Instagram." The other one said, "I'm not doing Facebook and I'm not doing all those groups anymore because it's a lot. It's a lot, and it's a weird kind of stress because your phone, unlike your colleagues, comes with you wherever you go." Right? And so, yeah, innovation is great, but we tend to underestimate the amount of energy and time that it takes to actually figure out what that innovation is going to mean over the next 6 to 12 months, what it's going to mean for us in terms of productivity, in terms of emotional state. And yeah, let me turn to mental health for just a second here.
Please.
We know from all the headlines and all the research that's being done that there is a ton of anxiety and depression that's happening post-COVID. And one of the factors is that everyone was suddenly forced to be remote, including people who had never been remote and had to learn all the software. And yeah, I mean, it's not fun for everybody to be stuck in their house all the time. So I do think that it has taken a toll on us regardless of generation. It's just that some have different expectations than others. How's that?
Splendid. Yeah, no. I
Splendid.
do a presentation on leadership where it around the impacts of leadership. And one of the biggest things is the impacts or what they don't control. And I list everything that people are going through right now. And I mean everything from housing crisis to interest rates to post COVID mental health challenges to working in an environment with their family right outside their door that they never had to work around before. And I'm like, and that's just Tuesday. And this has nothing to do with the actual work that they're going through. So even seeing somebody that you don't see physically in an office, even when they're remote, as you speak to mental health, there are so many, all these pressures that is impacting them, even more so being remote as one more thing that leaders, I don't think, embrace enough when it comes to what's going on, to read those social cues, to read the room, as it were, even if it's virtual.
Read the room, even if it's a breakout room on Zoom. Exactly. Read the Zoom room. So I think that for leaders to sound a little bit of an empathetic note here, I think that there are plenty of leaders who have not come up this way, have come from a generation. If we're going to talk about old white men, there are plenty of old white men leaders who've never had to think about the mental health of their people ever. And it was, discouraged when they started, right? It was discouraged to even talk about it or even think about it or even admit, "Oh, I'm not in a good mood today." Ugh. Oh, well, you must be weak ass, whatever you are, right? So there's a kind of generational ignorance or cluelessness or just lack of awareness to put it more politely, but also a kind of feeling like, well, I don't know how to deal with it. I mean, I can't deal with this in person. How am I going to deal with this online? How am I going to find the time to ask every single one of my, team, how are you today? I mean, really, how are you? What is happening in your life? What are you striving for? What is making you anxious today? How do you want to feel at the end of the day? Oh, there's so many questions people could ask, but who has time to ask a bunch of open-ended questions unless you're a coach, right? That is the attitude often. And so it's a whole new skill set that leaders are being asked to take on and being expected to take on, and that's a challenge. And it's much easier, believe me, as a coach, I can tell you, it's way more powerful to coach someone in person. Way more.
And it's funny you ask, oh, like I hear it, those questions you need to ask, those open, you have to have time to even not only ask, but listen to the answers that are being provided, but also all the pre work you need to do to create the psychological safety for people to actually answer those questions before you go through your checklist of how are you today? How are
Yeah.
things? How's the family?
Yeah.
It's so much to it. So
Yeah.
Janet, let's fix the world. How do you address this remote world? Like, where do you start if you're not familiar, if you're not comfortable? How do you start building that connection with a team that's always on the other side of a screen?
Hmm. Hmm. Okay. So first of all, leaders need to be in touch with themselves if they're going to get in touch with their people. So, and this is well known, every leader should find the courage and the time to do some work on themselves, to become more self aware. There are plenty of consultants and coaches out there to help them with that, to understand what their kind of dominant communication styles are, how they prefer to run meetings, how they might be perceived by other people. There are plenty of, you know, anxious, narcissistic people running around there with huge responsibility who have no idea that they put people off, who have no idea why everyone just says yes, 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 and then does something else, right? And then there are people who are super worried who don't show the kind of leadership that they could, even though they have the smarts. So we're not going anywhere without leaders who have at least some modicum of self awareness and who are willing to do the work to get there. And some people don't, some people find that very threatening, right? If you, I mean, I've met people like this. There are lots and lots of folks who are affable in public, who are good at cracking jokes, who have natural charisma, but inside they're in pain. They're in pain for any reason, any of the myriad reasons why humans are in pain. All of us have trauma. All of us. We just are taught not to talk about it and not to deal with it. So I've met people like that who, even doing a little bit of self-awareness work or admitting that, you know, they feel unsure or anxious or that they don't like what this happened, that brings up a ton of stuff. And then they get too emotional and then they lose control and they're terrified to show that side of themselves to anybody else. So, this work has to be done with somebody who can help them feel safe and help them get to a point where they can talk to their team while being themselves. And I've watched this happen. Um, so I do a ton of work with Boeing. So when COVID hit, the reaction at Boeing, which I'm sure was just like the reaction at many other places, at least on my team, was how are we going to pivot? How are we going to pivot? How are we going to pivot? Which way should we pivot? What are we going to do? Here, standing on end. Can we do this virtually? Can we do that virtually? Can we do all our programs virtually? Who's going to do virtual? Who knows how to do it? And it was all about how do we do this? What are the actions, right? How do we change the process? And that went on for a good 2.5 to 3 months. It was like end of April 2020. We were all freaked out. All of us were terrified that we were going to be laid off because who gets laid off first? The trainers and L&D folks. We were very lucky we were not laid off because we're under sales and marketing. But anyway, I started to think about it and I said, how about if we have a team meeting where we actually process what we're going through together, where we actually talk about what is happening to us now? Not how can we do it tomorrow,
Mm.
but what is actually happening to people? What do their home situations look like? How are they feeling? What are they doing to stay sane? And Russell, I had to explain this 2 or 3 times to the people above me and to my peers. They were like, "What kind of meeting do you want to have again? What's the purpose of this?" And I'm like, "We need some time together to actually process." And there was almost no understanding of that. And so I managed to push it through because everybody was freaked out, truly. And we had 2 meetings, and I remember our big senior director saying, I am at home with my wife and my 2 children and my in-laws, and we're stuck here. And I felt more empathy for him than I had ever. He's not the kind of guy to come and tell you all about what's happening. And, he's more like, here's the flow down, guys. What are your questions? And that was very, very powerful. The whole team was like, wow, that was great. I feel better. And, I'm simplifying, but it was a fight to even get there. So that's the first thing is that leaders are very often brought up in the system to think only in terms of action, only in terms of results. And we all know this, this is classic. But making the shift to not think like that, making the shift to spend time not only doing an icebreaker, but posing a prompt and putting people in breakout rooms, putting people from different cultures in breakout rooms, right? If they feel safe enough. And the way for them to feel safe enough is for the leader to get a little vulnerable themselves, go slowly, intentionally recognize, hey, we have 8 countries represented here on this call. We don't all have the same situation now during COVID or post COVID. We don't all have the same situation at home. Some of us are in the office in our home countries, some of us are not. Some of us are online at 9 o'clock at night. Some of us are on at 7 in the morning, despite the fact that we're not morning people. Let's talk about who we are and how we're doing, and let's have dedicated time to get to know each other, to connect. This is like, and so this is the key word, connection. I can't say it enough. Having moved to many cultures and trying to figure it out, I can't say that enough.
It's so interesting that this problem organizations have with intentional humanity versus reactive humanity. So, for instance, pandemic happens, people are freaking out. That's not about delivering a widget. That is a human reaction to a very scary thing. And then you come in and go, but let's have a human solution of empathy and compassion. They're like, what? But I'm trying to address the human reaction with intentional humanity. And it just seems like this foreign concept of trying to be an introduction of soft skills matter when things are scary. But it's still so foreign to organizations.
Yeah, and it's about so Russell, I listened to a couple of your other podcasts and you had some, very articulate people on. Parnell
Yeah.
and then Ingrid Christensen. And I think either both of them or one of them touched on this, that we're still, and you touched on it too. We are still, unfortunately, and probably worldwide, we are still functioning with the flawed assumption that we have a work persona and a home persona, that there are things that are, you know, professional behavior versus however we behave, after work is over or when we go to the bar. But yeah, I think it was Ingrid Christensen said, we bring ourselves with us wherever we go. Wherever you go, there you are. You can't leave half yourself at the door. You can learn how to manage your emotions so that you don't shout at somebody, right? Or you don't, you know, break down and leave the meeting without a word or whatever. But there's no way you can deny a whole side of yourself. But we insist on making the distinction, yet we're working, a lot of us, from home where we generally don't have that distinction, right? We're physically in the home. We're also wearing sweatpants. Guarantee you, right? So it's a matter of normalizing this idea like, hey, so I, like to have a beer when I'm done, or, I can't wait to have my kid get on my lap, or, my cat's doing something outrageous right now, but I can't laugh because I'm on a meeting with all of you, or whatever. Artificial.
Communication is a lot of what we're talking about here. It's not in how we show up, how we engage with others, nonverbal communication. How does that fit into connection and relationship building when we're talking about
Hmm.
remote and hybrid?
So communication is absolutely key, both verbal and nonverbal. Anybody who's been to South Asia will know, or even to Greece, will know that we have extremely strong cues in our brains as to what nonverbal communication means. So the head movements, when they're different, to signify agreement or disagreement, that can throw one off a lot. Have you ever been to South Asia, Russell? India or Nepal or anywhere like that?
I want to go so very badly, but no, I've never been.
Okay, I recommend, right? So the first time I went, I was all in work mode, right? This is in the early 2000s. I was in work mode. I had an assignment. I was the, consultant that they were sending around to deal with all the rats nests everywhere. This was a giant nonprofit in Washington that did global health. I get to Nepal. I say to the head of research, "Can you please, I need to do some qualitative research. I'm going to do a bunch of discussions. Could you please help me get a small recorder?" This is back in the days when you had, little pocket recorders. And this is what happened. He shook his head from right to left, which is absolutely normal for more than 1.5 billion people, right, on the earth. But I went, "What? Wait, why? Is that no? Why not? And I got very anxious. And my Canadian colleague who was standing next to me was like nudging me in the ribs with his elbow. That means yes. That means yes. It's okay. So like I had a mini panic, like, Okay, this person's gonna push back at me. What is happening?" Or in Greece and in Bulgaria, this is yes, right? What we would do for no is yes to the listeners who cannot see me. And those things are deep. The cues we have are deep. Like I have a big crease in my forehead. I find that sometimes if I'm intense and I'm talking like this, people think, oh, there's something wrong. She's intense. She's angry. She's this. She's that. No, I'm just trying to think of my next word, right? And so if we know ourselves, we can say, hey, this is what I do. Don't be put off. And when I say this, this is what I mean. You had a whole thing on definitions in one of your podcasts, which I love because we all make outrageous assumptions. Outrageous, right?
So here's an extra wrinkle to add to that from a remote experience wise. What if the camera's off? Because
Yeah,
there's a lot of people that do not feel comfortable putting cameras on. Others are forcing their employees to have cameras on. Others say you shouldn't have to. Like there's a very push and pull when it comes
yeah,
to cameras being on. And when it comes to different cultures, a lot you're explaining are verbal and nonverbal cues that you have
yep,
to see to understand and
yep,
pick up. So,
yep.
how do you address that in a non camera engagement?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that you have to be tolerant. And when there's a meeting, for example, a get to know you meeting, like get to know your colleagues meeting, where you're going to put people in breakout rooms and you're going to give them questions or you're going to ask them to do exercises together, where you warn them, give them a couple days, say, hey, we think that it would be a really much better experience for everybody, that you could connect faster and more deeply if you come with your camera on. If you have a camera. If you don't have a camera, okay, clearly that's fine. But just warn folks, because yeah, I get it. I mean, I think that people who live in spaces that are small, that don't allow them to have, a separate office, or I mean, there are all kinds of circumstances, right? We have to be cognizant of that. So I don't think it's a good idea for leaders with global teams to insist on camera use, all the time. Um, the other thing is one can model, like, I know folks at Boeing who model it. Mostly at Boeing, 98% of meetings are without cameras. I meet people all the time whose faces I don't get to see, and it's completely normal. But it's annoying for me. But I've also seen a couple leaders who model it. They turn their cameras on. They say, "Hey, I'm in China. I'm so happy to be back. I can't believe I didn't get to come here for 3 years during COVID. I'm in this hotel room. It's nice. People are not wearing masks, and he's in his polo shirt with his hair mussed. He probably got off the plane 5 hours before, and that makes us feel more comfortable. It really does. And so what I've noticed is that the response to that is then a lot of people do turn their cameras on when they see that he's on live. And then after a while, people turn their cameras off. So there's that sense of, oh, hi, we're going to greet each other.
Mm.
Yeah. Hey, hey, look at what you're wearing, or hey, you're looking good, or whatever, or where are you now? Or whose monkey is that over there, or whatever, right? Whatever's going on, or parrot. um, but then and establish contact, right? And let's let's not completely vilify remote either, because I've been in breakout rooms where we did that. We had kind of the first 10 minutes with the camera on and then another 10 minutes with the camera off because something was happening, but we were able to continue a deeper conversation without a problem. And we connected brilliantly. I mean, there are all kinds of ways out there to connect. Not just the usual icebreaker like, okay, what'd you have for breakfast? Go around the room.
Mm.
Yeah, if you have an international team, it could be interesting. Like somebody had lentils for breakfast, somebody had waffles, somebody had meat, whatever, right? It doesn't matter. It's really a mix of intentional humanity and tolerance, flexibility, agility.
So, let's talk about intention because there's a few things as leaders, as managers, as supervisors that we have to do, or really, really should do, which is recognition and empowerment.
hmm
What does that look like in a remote world?
So I know teams who do regular weekly meetings where they start with recognition. And that's a nice practice. It's so simple. Whoever's leading the meeting says, okay, who wants to recognize someone this week? And in the beginning, it's awkward. Nobody wants to start. So usually the leader has to start. And then it becomes, kind of run of the mill. And then it's really nice. And people chime in. Like somebody recognizes person X, and then another person goes, "Yeah, I echo that. Yeah, person X did an awesome job." Empowerment, in terms of different personality types or to behavioral tendencies and preferences, introverts versus extroverts. That's another thing which I think is nice to prepare people for, right? Because the extroverts in the group are always going to be ready to speak up, but the introverts are going to wait, they're going to hang back, or they're going to stop the minute someone else makes a noise, right? That happens to me a lot. I have a colleague who does that, and he's the best. And I sometimes just say, uh-huh, and he stops. So if you prepare people like, hey, we're going to ask everybody to give a 5-minute talk on X, give their status, or give one slide on something, you know, please be prepared to talk. We'd love it if you turn your camera on. Please be prepared to share a slide or you don't need a slide so that everybody kind of gets a chance. And that way the people in the room who sometimes struggle with the language, because of course, like, I work on a team where English, of course, is the lingua franca, but we have lots and lots of people whose first language is Mandarin or Thai or, you know, French. So by doing small bites, letting people talk or asking them to speak and to speak to each other, maybe get them ready by having them speak in small groups, and then at a later meeting having them speak to the whole group. That way they get used to it. They don't feel as unsafe. People won't ridicule them, and people will be used to hearing them. Some people are still not able to stop themselves from ridiculing. Those people are further and farther between, but or fewer and farther between. But sometimes you get unpleasantly surprised.
So you're being an intentional leader, a leader who's learning how to work with a remote team. How do you know it's successful? How do you know you're building a culture that's working? And how do you know if it's not?
Great question. So there's the old, you know, anonymous survey thing. That can be done. That's not always successful. What I find is it's much nicer to hold a meeting where you pick a couple of open-ended questions that kind of gets at it in an indirect way and get people to answer those in a way that feels safe for them. You could ask people to rate, if you thought people were comfortable, you could ask people to rate their own feeling of comfort at meetings. That's a fairly straightforward one. If you could rate your comfort level at meetings when you started on this team versus now, what would those two scores look like from 1 to 5 or 1 to 10, doesn't matter, right? Or this is what I love. Here's the kind of questions that I like as a coach. Who were you being when you joined the team during meetings? And who are you being now at meetings? How do you feel? Right? That's another way of asking, how do you feel in your skin when you're with the rest of the team or when you're with part of the team? Or how likely are you to bring an idea to somebody? How likely are you to volunteer to figure something out or start a new process or tweak an old process or whatever it is? There there are some ways of measuring, but it's all intangible.
So what's intangible as a perfect example of that? Because I will deal with or I'll work with people that are extroverted. I have every idea of what's going on with them, but
Uh-huh.
you get the neurodivergence, you get the introverts, and you're like, I would be amazed if I heard from you at all, but you deliver amazing work.
Yeah.
So how do you what's an intangible way that's not just intentional like a survey, which I fully support, but what is that as a leader knowing that the culture is working?
I think the leader has to find the time and the courage to cultivate those introverts, talk to them one on one. That's tough, but leaders who do that have more success, in my opinion. leaders who make time to do a one-on-one regularly, whether it's every 2 weeks or not. Most introverts I know are deep and they have plenty, they have plenty to say. Even in our culture, sort of North America, I meet introverts who are just like, I don't need to talk. Everyone else is busy talking. I know how to do my job, right? So they don't feel that need. But if you sit with them and you say, hey, we've got great results from you on the team. How are you doing? What would you like to do more of? What are your observations about the team? Or, figure out a way to connect with those people. It might not be as easy as it is with the extroverts, but sometimes the extroverts are just talking because they're used to talking, and you don't necessarily get, you know, valuable information from them when they're talking. And there's so much information out there now available to educate yourself about working with so-called neurodivergent folks. Some of the psychotherapists that I know are, for example, they've stopped talking about an autism spectrum because basically we're all on a spectrum,
Mm.
right? And it's kind of like, well, this person just has different behavior from me. I have to figure out a way to connect with them in a way that gets them going, not because they need to be a talker, but because we need to feel connected so that when I come to them in a crisis or with a larger assignment, they'll feel safe enough to respond in some way, like, oh, I'm not comfortable doing that, or okay, if you want me to do that, I need X, Y, and Z, right? I need somebody to assist me. I need this kind of resources, blah, blah.
If you're focused so much, we've been talking very much about a leader with a team. How are you connecting a remote team to the larger values, mission, vision of an organization? So it's not just about creating a subculture, but it's a matter of connecting it to the larger culture.
With a remote team, I first of all, they need to understand what the larger vision and values are. That has to be explained in a straightforward, simple way with examples, right? So many times somebody puts up a list. These are the corporate values, blah, 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 and blah. Cool. Okay. And ask me in 2 days and I will have forgotten. There's nothing better than an illustrative example, especially if it's um, poignant, if it comes with some emotion, right? And this is something that I've forgotten to say, but anytime you can get people to feel during a meeting, they will remember that meeting. So emotion is something that touches us, and it's not a negative. Like if we're moved by something, we're going to remember. So bring examples, explain what's happening, define things, define terms. You and I are fans of that. And then do it again a few months later, right? Repetition is also good. But then the next time you do it, ask folks ahead of time to bring an example that they think illustrates one of the corporate values of their choice. Ask them to come with how they would explain the vision of the company to a 10-year-old or to their grandmother, right? Stretch people a little bit. There's nothing better to test your own understanding of something than trying to explain it to someone else. And then also, as a leader, if you can be aware enough during a different sort of meeting, right? You're not presenting the vision and values. If you're aware during a different sort of meeting with your peers, with a larger group, doesn't matter, right? If you're aware that this is a moment that demonstrates the vision or one of the values, bring it up, connect it, connect the dots for people. I can't, I work with learning experiences, executive development, leadership development. There's nothing better than a presenter who gets to the end and says, okay, so what were we talking about at the beginning? And everybody goes, I don't know. So connect it back, right? Take the bubbles and put them together, make the Venn diagram, figure out what's in the middle.
So, Janet, I have to wrap up the episode as I wrap up all episodes, which the final question, which is what's one simple action people can do right now to improve their relationships at work, remotely or not?
Sit down with the peer or the boss that intimidates you the most or makes you the most nervous and have a one-on-one for 15 minutes and try to connect. Push yourself out of your comfort zone. Everybody needs to connect.
That is Janet Livingstone. She is the founder of Culture is Key and co-host of the Original Syndrome podcast. Thanks so much for being here, Janet.
Thank you, Russell. It was a pleasure. Let me say that again. Let me say that again. It was a pleasure, not a pressure. Jesus. Okay.
It was such a pleasure. The word got out of your mouth wrong. I love it.
Yeah. This hat, right? These are the things that they should be the easiest things, right? And then you go, it was a, yeah. Thanks, Russell.
And that is done on another episode of Relationships at Work, the leadership guide to creating a workplace we love. I'm Russell. Thank you so much for joining me once again. If you have a moment and think this is an episode that would really help others in their remote work challenges and journey, share it with them, whether it's in conversation, an email, a social share, as it were. It just helps the podcast grow a little bit and helps all of us create that workplace that we want to work at. Take care.